Thank you everyone for coming. Hello. Welcome to On the Same Page, Artist Books as a Site of Intersection, a program of the SG Art Book Dialogue, which is a series of book launches, discussions, and artist talks organized by the Singapore Art Book Fair. My name is Bernie Tan, and I'm curator of the new design collection at Singapore Art Museum, and I will be moderating this session today. SAM Design Collection is very pleased to co-present 3 of the SG Art Book Dialogue programs this year, including this one, for the milestone 10th edition of the Singapore Art Book Fair. The Singapore Art Book Fair is an annual multi-day event celebrating contemporary art books and zines. SGABF is committed to deepening the understanding of art books in Singapore and encouraging the exploration of this diverse medium as a crucial, if not central, part of art practices. The fair is organized by Think Books, a center for art book events and initiatives in Singapore. The fair would like to thank their partners and sponsors, the Singapore Art Museum, AVS, Allegro, B-Cube, Oval Singapore, Boss Coffee, Jome, and Currency Design. For more information, please visit their website at singaporeartbookfair.org or follow them on Instagram at Singapore Art Book Fair. The SAM Design Collection examines multi-, inter-, and transdisciplinary practices at the intersection of contemporary art and design. It seeks to complicate long-held binaries and hierarchies that have typically separated art and design, despite persistent convergences. Design is positioned not as a monolithic and distinct sphere, but rather as a perspective through which SAM can engage with an expanded field of creative practitioners, including those working with art books. So the 3 programs that the collection is co-presenting this year move through the art book ecosystem from macro to micro, art book fair organizers, design studios who work in print, and finally, independent practitioners. So following our keynote on Friday and the panel before this one, this third panel brings together 3 independent practitioners who have connected with each other across continents and across disciplines, discussing compelling individual projects as well as their collaborations. This conversation will shift between the perspectives of artist, designer, curator, researcher, publisher, archivist, and so on, demonstrating how artist books can be a rich space of hybridity and experimentation. So I'll not go too deeply into introductions, as they will be much better ambassadors for their own practices very shortly, but we are very pleased to have with us today Claudia De La Torre, a Mexican Berlin-based artist, educator, and independent publisher. She is the founder of Backbone Books, a platform for publishing and conceptualizing artist books. Oscar Salguero is an independent curator, researcher, and archivist based in Brooklyn. Among his projects is the Interspecies Library, the first archive of artist books exploring various subjects of interspecies research. Finally, we have Darius O, a graphic designer from Singapore whose practice focuses on typography, motion design, and graphic laws. He also runs Hyperpress, which explores the intersections of 3D printing, graphic design, and publishing. And so after their presentations, we will move into a moderated discussion followed by a Q&A. So without further ado, we'll begin the session with a presentation from Claudia.
Hello, hello. Yes. Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be here and also very thankful to be for the first time in Singapore. Thanks to the organizers and to Renee for bringing me here. I'm very excited to be able to share what I do with all of you. So thank you. I'm going to start off by kind of describing what I do. When people see my work, they kind of think I'm a designer, but actually I'm a visual artist. I say that my work, like the umbrella of my work, is the book. So first of all, I'm an artist, but I'm also a publisher. I started Backbone Books in 2011, and thus far, I've designed, conceptualized, and published 91 artist books. I started it as a platform to self-publish myself, but it has grown into an organic being where I also invite other artists to collaborate with me and to rethink what a book can be. And thirdly, I'm an educator. I started the Artist Books Workshop, which is a workshop that I started about 4 years ago. And I lead artist book workshops in my studio in Berlin. So I would say these 3 fields are interconnected fields, which all of them, the brain of all of these 3 fields, is the book. I am also a member of ABC, the Artist Books Cooperative, a group of international artists that collaborate into making publications and exhibitions about artist books and artist publications. A book. A book is an encounter. It's time. It's a body. It is a work of art. It is space, and it is an idea. This is me, and this is my studio in Berlin, where I spend 90% of my time. Here is where I think, where I create, where I invite other people to have discussions, to share my artist books collection, and to create together. As you see, in this space, I have just a chair, a printer, and my books, and that is everything I need in order to come up with new ideas. I like to think that the book is not only an object, but it is a dynamic creature that encompasses space and time. A book is a space that needs to be activated, that needs to be touched in order for it to exist. As I mentioned, I started Backbone Books in 2011, and it has become the most important part in my artistic practice. I consider that every book I've ever published is an artist's work by itself. Whenever I'm invited to exhibit somewhere, I try to bring the book as a central part in my work. Maybe you know, but usually books are always in the background, in the periphery, in the backside of the gallery. And it's not often that they are like the middle. And to me, there always are. I also try to think the idea of the book is not just a physical form, but it can also extend to the room in the installation. So a gallery space, the walls of the gallery space could be considered blank pages. But Backbone Books, I try to define it as a kind of a footnote that is always a processual way of thinking. By processual, I envision it that every book I've ever made does not start with a form, right? So the form defines itself through the process. And this process follows kind of like different ways, but it always starts with a thought. The thought that slowly transforms into an idea, that slowly transforms into a concept, that has different variables, that when I work with them slowly start to take a form. So they embody themselves, and at the end, the work is not finished until it is public, so until it's published, and it starts actually taking its function. So a book is like an organic being that is always changing, and that it is in constant movement. It is not like other works of art that you have just to look at them and it activates, but a book you actually have to touch, taking the hand to actually make it leave. That's something that I find quite amazing. Here are just like a few examples of books that I consider are objects in space that need this activation. And I'd like to just share with you one project. Hello? One project that is actually now on view, and that it's a perfect example to show how the works I do can live in the exhibition space and outside of the exhibition space. So this project is an ongoing project which I started in 2013 when I had my first institutional show in the Kunsthalle in Baden-Baden. And I had the first opportunity to activate an exhibition space. And I titled it The Questions Library. And the Questions Library follows a very simple premise. And it is that I collect, show, and classify books that have a question as a title. And every time I show this collection, I invite the public to donate a book to the ongoing library. Therefore, visiting the show or visiting the exhibition, you encounter a library, a space we all know about, but instead of getting answers out of it, it's more about those questions that are posed by the books themselves. So this is a close-up of some of the books, classified not by its title, but by the question that they pose. And to me, it's important that the space exists as a kind of conversational space where people that come in can also have conversations with me around the idea of what they encounter in space. Here are some of the tools that I use to date the books, to give them a signature. Books are also space and can exist within space. The pages of the book, but also the pages of the exhibition. This work is called The Satellite Variations, and it's composed out of a very simple idea, which is taking a science fiction book, which is called the Satellite Variations by James Blish, Cities in Flight, by James Blish. And what I did is that I constructed a story surrounding the story of this novel by dog-earing the pages of a book. So basically, I took this novel and I folded the pages one by one, and by folding those pages, I created a triangle that points to one word, right? So throughout the 560 pages of the book, I created a new novel that actually makes sense. And in the installation, I show the book, what you see in the right, but I also made a vinyl, a record, with a recording of that story. So in a way, the vinyl itself, it's also an object that it's like spinning around, right? Like the satellites of Saturn. So it's an object in itself that's also surrounding the work. And the record also has a side A, but it also has a side B to it, right? So the side B of the record is the same dog ear, which I folded to the other side of the book, so it makes no sense at all. Very much in the Dada tradition. Here's an example of the book, the original book. And here is a kind of those words that I selected, extracted from the body of the text. So emotion, sea, space, occasionally, unpredictable. So I'm also interested in creating new narratives out of existing narratives. This is a close-up of the record. And this is a kind of a strategy, like how I actually made the text, right? I selected one word per page, as I mentioned. There's infinity of ways how a text could flow. So here I have like all of these different ways the story could go. The unknown places, the known, it's enough to make, is transforming. So I had to select in order to continue the story. And then I made a pocket version of that book, which you can find on my booth. I followed this strategy of folding the pages just because it also shows that the book is a three-dimensional object. It's not only a flat object, but it's actually a volume. And one of these original books, you can see later here. I have it here. And these corners, I also, as you can see, translate them into the space of exhibitions. So the white space of the wall becomes also a page. And the triangles are in relation to the space. So if the walls are 10 meters high, then the corners would relate to the book format and the wall format. Once I was fed of my work and I said, Claudia, don't make books anymore, try to do something else. And I created this work, which is called Cheater. Like I was cheating myself. And when I look at it, it's a book, right? So it's like, it's on the floor, but at the end it's a book. And I realized that I cannot lie to myself, like this is what I do. And I try to see it from different angles, right? Book form in space, within space. These are all photocopies of Ikebana books, yeah. And I would just like to end up with an example of a book I've published from another artist, because my work is not only about myself, but it's also about having dialogue together with other artists. This one is called The Book That Tends to Disappear by a Venezuelan artist called Simon Ramirez. He's New York-based. And I published it back in 2023. And this book is really, really beautiful. As you can see, it's a long format. It's like this format. And it is printed on thermal paper, which means that the image that you see there, in the future, it will disappear. So because of the light, you know. So in a way, it's funny to think that books are not objects that will stay untouched forever. They change. They are organic beings. So here you can see another example of the last show I had in New York, my first major solo show in New York. And this show was made by using a photocopy machine that you see in the space and different prompts. And the idea was that users could photocopy those shapes and place them on the wall. And the next person that kind of like went into the space would have to use the previous copy and make a new copy out of it. So therefore, the shapes would, you know, evolution and change through time. The work is called palimpsest, and palimpsest means those things that are layered upon. So in a way, I'm interested also in the idea of what is a copy and what is an original. Yeah, this is a result. You can see the evolution of the shape. And to me, this is also a book.
Okay, we'll hand it over to Oscar now.
All right, can you guys hear me? All right, thank you, first of all, for the invitation, Bernie and everyone here. We're having a great time, Claudia and I. It's our first time in Singapore, 19 hours flight, and it's definitely worth it. So my name is Oscar Salguero. I am a curator and researcher, archivist based in New York. Originally, I'm trained as an industrial designer, so I got into this subject of books and research and ecology, mostly from curiosity. It's not something I was taught in school. It's just something that I observed in culture. And I really felt that there's an energy and an excitement there that I needed to participate in and to document. So a few years ago, in 2019, I started this project called the Interspecies Library. It came from, let's go here. Yeah, it came from this idea of basically, when I was in school, in design school, there was this idea of human-centered design. So everything we're taught is like how to design for human needs, the needs of a user, and weirdly or oddly, it was never considered of the non-human life forms around us. That is vegetation, you know, plants, bacteria, insects, etc. They are affected by the things we create, by the things we extract from the earth, and how we get rid of our objects. So this shift between the ego and the eco is very important, and it's something I started noticing in designers starting like in the early 2010s. So this is a book that was really inspiring to me in my research. This is a book from 2007 called Pig 05049. It was a design student who basically came up with this concept of creating an encyclopedia of what happens to a single animal after we kill it, especially an animal that is in a farm. So the spine is the tag that they put on the pig ear, and the table of content is the body of the animal. So the chapters in this encyclopedia basically are divided by the parts of the animal: bones, skin, blood, etc. Even the book itself is produced with glue that derives from the bone of the animal, the bone of the pig. So this is like really something that's when I started to pay attention to the idea, the power of a book as a documentation, as an artifact that documents this transition in our culture, where we're becoming more and more aware of how we are interacting with other species. These couple of projects here are I Want to Deliver a Dolphin by a Japanese artist, Ai Hasegawa, and Goatman, which is an artist from England. So right around these are the design students who were using their imagination and speculative thinking to imagine these scenarios in which, what happens if a human can deliver another animal? Or what happens if we become another animal? So these questions were being asked, and they were being translated into books. So these are some examples of the terms that started to appear, like non-human, more than human, interspecies, multi-species. So around the same time, I started to see a few artists or collectives in America that were interested in this subject, like the Feminist Bear Club, founded in 2016, the Institute for Interspecies Art and Relations in 2017, and the Institute of Queer Ecology in 2017. So in this ecology of organizations, I decided to start a new project, which is the Interspecies Library. So that's my cat, his name is Willow, and that's my wife. They are the biggest inspiration for me. That's how I really got into this subject more deeply. My wife is an artist, and Willow is, I never lived with an animal before, so when we adopted Willow, it really got me to become more and more aware of these relationships. So in 2020, right around the beginning of the pandemic, I decided to make this a real thing. So in my apartment in Bushwick, I invited people to this exhibition called Human Non-Human, 10 books on interspecies interactions. And as you can see here, it's just a one-bedroom apartment, and I turned the living room into a space to talk about books and to browse books together. The next chapter for me was this exhibition at the Center for Book Arts, and I called it Interspecies Futures, or IF for short. It was basically a collection of books exploring the what-if scenarios in our future collectively. And I selected 17 books from different parts of the world, including Singaporean artist Robert Zhao from the Institute of Critical Zoologists. And this show was an incredible experience for me. That's how I actually collaborated with Claudia for the first time. So I'll show you here some more images. And they gave me the opportunity to develop a catalog. So it was the first time I ever created a book. And I had to contact Claudia, who I originally met her at the New York Art Book Fair in 2018. I stopped by her booth, and I was amazed by the kind of work that she does. And I told her, we're going to work together in the future. She didn't believe it, I guess, but then I contacted her and says, Claudia, you need to design my catalog. So this is our collaboration. Yes, and I have it here. And I'll read something quickly, actually. Claudia and I are big fans of thank you. We're big fans of a Mexican archivist, Ulises Carrion. He was a conceptual artist, archivist, and the book opens with this quote. Ulises says, "I firmly believe that every book that now exists will eventually disappear, and I see here no reason for lamentation. Like any other living organism, books will grow, multiply, change color, and eventually die." So that was a very important phrase for me, because it created this connection between books and life, organisms, non-humans. The book is its own entity. It's going to change. And it's okay to accept that. And maybe that's why we like it as well, because it reminds us of us, our mortality. So this is the book. It was really quite experimental. It was presented like a sci-fi anthology of 17 alternative realities. And every chapter you would open this fold out and you will reveal a different book as a portal to these new, these different realities. So I also presented the interspecies library publicly for the first time, and then subsequently I was asked to show the books in different places. This is in Brooklyn at the NARS Foundation. This is in Prague in Czech Republic. And then this is a place that eventually for me became a gathering space. It's in my living room in Brooklyn still. And now I invite anyone who wants to come, who stops by New York, to come and see the books. These are artists from Mexico, Canada, California, Texas, Netherlands, just in this small sample of visits. So I'll talk briefly about this other project, which is Neomineralia. This is also my interest in the idea of the concept of geology and minerals, and how artists are also paying attention to our relationship to that. This is a show I curated at Center for Craft in North Carolina. And this also eventually became a new type of library, which I called the Neomineralia Library. You can see here. So this is artist books where the artists are exploring our relationship with geology, minerals, rocks, and lands. So this is a small sample of that, and I recently showcased a special version at the University of Kansas. So I will end with one other project, which is with Darius. So this is the Journal of Thorough Linguistics, which started last year. And it's inspired by a story by a sci-fi writer, Ursula Le Guin. It's an American writer who, in 1974, came up with this incredible concept of thorough linguistics, the language of non-humans or other organisms. So over the last 50 years, since this short story, there's been a lot of advances in animal communication and also in the use of AI in how we're approaching the communication of other species. So I started doing this idea of developing a real journal of thorough linguistics. So Darius will probably expand on this after, but this is something I just wanted to share with you because it's a really beautiful exercise in collaboration between my kind of conceptual approach and Darius' graphics. Yeah. There is a printed version which is available at the fair today, if anyone is interested. So thank you so much.
So I'm very happy here today. My name is Darius. I'm very happy that the Singapore Art Book Fair and Singapore Art Museum Design Collection, Bernie has invited me to give this talk today about my ongoing research about 3D printed books. So just a quick introduction. So I'm formally trained as a graphic designer, and I work with a lot of visual. I work on a lot of visual identities that deal with motion and typographic-centric approaches. But today I'm just really going to talk about 3D printing and 3D printed books because it's our book fair, right? But before I go in, just bear with me. I have a little bit of technicals to go into. So for those of you in the crowd who is not familiar with 3D printing, the 3D printing term that I'm talking about today relates to one specific kind of 3D printing called the FDM, Fused Deposition Modeling. So a quick intro, it's basically a machine that has gantries on the X, Y, and Z axis that actually allow for material to be deposited in a three-dimensional space to achieve a printed object. It's as simple as that. This video probably is actually 16 minutes long, but I cut it down to a few seconds for everyone. So, as I mentioned, it deposits material layer by layer, and there are a lot of technicals that I do not have the time to go through today, but all you need to know is that the 3D printer works with this mechanic. So, to me, 3D printing is a misnomer. Firstly, because if you call it 3D printing, you're alluding to the idea that traditional paper print is two-dimensional, which is not true. But also this idea that conventional paper printing normally would actually involve a certain substrate, a medium, that has a surface of which a certain mark is being imprinted on. But for 3D printing, especially for FDM, it's not exactly the same process. There is actually no substrate. If you were to print or approach 3D printing in terms of paper printing, you would realize that you need to somehow print the paper as well, because there's no ideas of substrate, surfaces, and everything. There's no pre-existing material that 3D printing uses. So, in fact, if you look at the history of the evolution of both technologies, both in conventional printing and in 3D printing, you will realize that the architecture and the technology of the 3D printer physically actually has roots in CNC milling. It actually has a different ancestry, and it only converges back to when we were still carving on stones. The print technology basically, the paper print technology basically came from carving on stones, making marks on stones. We moved on to using tools and instruments to actually make our marks, and eventually to wood block printing, to movable press, and finally to offset printing. Whereas on the other side of things, we actually went from a couple of subtractive manufacturing to additive manufacturing to plastic molding to CNC, and then actually to 3D printing. So this is something that I've been thinking about, this idea that by coining the term 3D printing, additive manufacturing, which is the technical term for 3D printing, has been implicated into the agency and the domain of print, and in turn to publishing and graphic design. These fields from very divergent paths and ancestries are actually bound to converge again into the collective future. This idea that if you call it a 3D printer, why is it that, let's say for me, a graphic designer, why am I not all over it? Because graphic designers are supposed to be these purveyors of print, right? So something interesting, like what I said just now, was also this idea that in 3D printing, you don't go through the exact same process as traditional, or I call it classical printing methods. This idea that the surface is actually also the material, and it's also the sign. Because when I 3D print a book, let's say over here, you can have a look later, it's this idea that I have to 3D print the page, the substrate, and I have to print graphics onto that page, which is the exact same material, it's the exact same process. It's within one print file and one print process. So everything is being compressed, and sort of like, I call it the displacement of the press vector, the idea that where is the press now, where does the print happen? So I started to explore 3D printing as also with this idea of like printmaking and mark making in mind. And so 3D printer was never meant for printing flat. And so on the internet, if you search for common 3D printed issues, you'll find a lot of images like this when they actually complain about why is my bottom surface so ugly and stuff like that. But to me, they are beautiful because there's a lot of textures that I think it belongs only to the 3D printing domain, to the FDM technology. And I started my first test print for text and graphics on a very thin piece of 3D printed substrate in 2021. And I was really trying to look for a certain gap to explore somewhere in between the idea of like mark making as graphic design and also object making as 3D printing, additive manufacturing. So my idea is that instead of focusing on the volume of the 3D printer, what if we look at the surface? And what if we brought those methodologies to classical printing, to paper print? How can classical print, paper print, be seen in a new dimension? This idea that can we have, think about extra dimensions in print, in paper print right now, layer output and things like that. So that's really where the name Hyperpress came from. So Hyperpress is the name of my body of work. It's exploring 3D printed press. This idea of like the print that goes beyond the surface. It goes beyond where classical print normally ends, which is on the surface. So 3D printed books. So I have to firstly preface that I'm not the first person to explore a 3D printed book in the world. The first person to actually try out something like this and using the material, TPU material, which is a soft plastic material to, achieve a certain recognizable form of a book is actually by this designer. I think she's a Spanish designer, Jennifer Martin Lorente. This book actually explores the usage, the function of the 3D printer to be able to print volume with respect to accessing previously excluded communities like the blind. So this book actually has Braille letters printed, because I think that it's quite an organic process to think about when you have a technology that can print in volume in 3D. The first thing to think about is, you can do emboss, sort of like quote-unquote embossing of graphics or of alphabets. So when I was exploring this is really the only project that I felt was able to achieve a certain form that was very much close to what I would call a book, function like a book, soft enough to open into a spread and stuff like that. So the word volume, we have actually always have been thinking about books in terms of volumes. The word itself actually has roots in this Latin word called voluere, which means to roll, and it actually precedes our description or the sense of using the word to describe a measure of space. So by volumizing the press, the 3D printing, using 3D printing as as the press, thinking about it as a printing press, we are actually able to return the book's roots to the volume. And this is my first book. It's a prototype called Sliced. It's a very quick, actually it's not very quick, it took me a year. But spread over a year, each page takes about, during that time it was around 6 to 8 hours per page, because I was also trying out different things while playing with the technology. So here you can see things are not too perfect yet. And this is my second book, which is here. It's called Corpus. By this time in 2022, 2023, I was a little bit more comfortable with the technology. I understood a little bit better, and I was able to explore other themes in content-wise, let's say. So this book is actually about the death of print and the idea of like mortality within print. What do we mean by print is dying and stuff like that? So if you want to have a look later, you can come over to the stage. So yeah, some more pictures of Corpus. And lastly, I just wanted to share a little bit about the process of making these 3D printed books. Other than 3D printing books, I started to really draw the connection between 3D printing and graphic design itself. As so this idea of like object making and mark making. How can the 3D printer unite both of them? And these are actually the graphics that you see in my second book, Corpus. They are actually derived from actual 3D models. So they are actually 3D models of dead trees. How I derive those models is really through a process that I use the 3D printing software, which slices up 3D models into layers so that you can understand what to print layer by layer. And through that, I was really exploring it through the lens of mark making, really, of making graphics and illustrations. And why trees? Why did I use the models of trees? Because I wanted to reference the ancient Western manuscripts, which always adorn the edges of their pages with flora. Which is quite ironic and poetic at the same time. The idea that you kill or you cut down those trees to make a paper book, and then you sort of like paint the trees and the flowers back onto the page. So yeah, using this method, I was able to get this very distinctive looking graphical style that I really enjoy making. And this is something that only the 3D printed or only the 3D printing technology can offer. So I've used these graphics in a couple of commercial projects, so removed by their context already, really exploring them as purely as a flattened aesthetic to be used for other graphic design projects. So this is pterolinguistics, as Oscar has shared just now. This is my attempt of finding letters within those graphics that I've created. So I don't have 100% control of the actual graphics that I can generate because it's a very collaborative process with the 3D printing software. So I can only find certain parts that perhaps looks like a G or looks like an S, looks like an L, and then bringing them back together for typography. Other methods include this idea that my first 3D printed book didn't fare too well in terms of its binding. It's always breaking apart. So for the second book, I actually tried this idea of like using the actual heat from the 3D printer to melt the edges of the material so that I can achieve a certain binding without the need for any adhesives or even staplers. So you can think of the 3D printer book, my second book here, as truly a singular, materially a singular object, because materially there's nothing extra being added to it. So my future research has got to do with this idea of like, if I want to bring 3D printing into graphic design, there is one very, very important thing that I have to solve first, which is legibility. I'm not sure if you've seen the images just now. The text is not really readable yet, right? So the 3D printing, a 3D printer actually doesn't know that it's printing text. It doesn't know it's printing anything. It only knows that it's making objects. So every single path that it takes, it always must complete the loop. It starts and ends at the same point. It thinks that it needs to make something watertight, like a vase. So it's very difficult to actually teach the 3D printer to understand that it's writing. So I like to see this process of like figuring out how to teach the 3D printer to write, or at least to understand that, you know, I'm trying to print text. Even uploading like a single line, it doesn't just print a single line. It has to go back to the start. So the line becomes very thick. And there are a lot of other issues that I don't have the liberty or time to go into. But basically what I did was, through a lot of tests, I actually developed a typeface that was purpose-built for 3D printing. And this is similar to, I think, for the graphic designers in the crowd today, you might know what are ink traps. So ink traps, in type design terms, is actually design decisions that bake into how certain typefaces are designed to ensure that it prints well with ink. So I actually developed this method, which I call the path traps. So basically, I'm trying to control the path of the 3D printing process and the 3D printing nozzle. Here you can see a quick demonstration that if you load in a paragraph of text, by the way, it doesn't always print line by line because it goes to the next nearest neighbor. So with my typeface, with certain design decisions, which I cannot go into now, but I managed to get it to at least print line by line in a zigzag manner. So here is the latest test. That's a 10-cent coin, Singaporean 10-cent coin on the top right. So I managed to get it down to 0.2 cm, which is 2 mm x height, which I think is probably the smallest that my 3D printer can handle right now. So other experiments include using shape memory polymer. So this is a special material that can actually change its form under heat and return to its initial printed form if it's reheated again. So for this particular project, I was trying to use this material to sort of like explore whether I can return the 3D printed book into its filament form. So printed as a book, but being printed in a way that I can actually roll it back into a single filament strip. And lastly, my latest exploration is, if you situate print with the 3D printer, it's very easy to think about the 3D printed book or pages as technology. And as a technology, it becomes more organic to think about, including circuits within the 3D printed page. So here is a actual conductive filament being sandwiched in between the plastics of the 3D printed page, and I was able to use code to sense where the person is actually touching, and certain words of the page can actually be recorded as information, which I will actually display different images based on where they are touching and which word they are touching. So yeah, the whole point is to break this perception that graphic design is inherently flat or two-dimensional. I'm looking at this idea that can it be dimension agnostic? Can we not think about 3D print as purely for 3D? Or can we not think about graphic design purely as 2D? And trying to break away from that. So if you're more interested, you can find out more on my IG, Hyperpress or Darius O. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you to our three speakers. So we'll proceed to the moderated discussion. Some of the books that they talked about are on this table over here. So after the talk, you are free to come and, in Darius's case, a supervised browsing of his very precious 3D book. And then after that, maybe we might bring it outside because we have another program following that. Yeah. So I think, as you can see, there are three very different takes on how to build practices around the form of a book. And actually how this talk came about was that I asked Darius, is there anyone internationally that he would want to be in conversation with? And he brought up both of their names because of the collaborations that they've done in the past. So I think I want to begin actually by asking, how did you first encounter each other's practices and what you enjoy most about each other's practices?
Maybe we can start, because you were the first.
Yeah, so like I was mentioning, I met Claudia in an art book fair in New York in 2018. And I think what I really liked about her work is that she saw the potential of the book as something beyond the book as we understand it, but as a platform for infinite studies and infinite variations and infinite questions. And I think that to me was like really powerful. And I've known her for a few years now, and her imagination towards the book is endless, and I think that's really, really strong and inspiring to me. Darius, I met him on Instagram. We exchanged messages on Instagram, and we sort of like each other's work. And for him, I really appreciated that. To me, like Darius is like imagining the future of the book in a way, like the idea of a book as a volume, not just as like maybe a sequence of things, but maybe as the materially and physically as something that is transcending just the object that we understand right now.
Hello? Oh, yeah. I would say that Oscar is my most bookish friend. So it would even be interesting to share with you like all the conversations that we've had throughout the years, because I believe 99% of the conversations are about books. And every time he encounters something interesting, he says, Claudia, you have to check this out, you have to check this out. And that's how he sent me Darius's work. And I was like so blown away. Like I was like, what is this guy doing? Like I was really so inspired by, and I even thought like, why haven't I seen this before? Why has nobody else tried this before? So first of all, what I really admire of Oscar is that he is a curious being. Like he's not egocentric, he is sharing all of his knowledge. And I believe that that has such a value, you know? And he opens up the door to people to see what we thought we knew with different eyes. So to me, both of them are eye-openers. Like after I met them, I see things with different eyes, and that's something very valuable. And yesterday I was reading some of my notes, and I stick with this one where Jean-Luc Godard said, it's not about what you do with things or where you take things from, but what you do with them. And I think both of them are like this kind of sponges that take in what's happening, make them their own, and show us something different. So that's what I really admire of them.
Yeah, for me, yeah, as mentioned, both of them met me, or I met both of them through Instagram. But I actually did visit Oscar in New York City last year. And yeah, for me, what is really interesting about Oscar's practice is this idea that he's not just very much interested in the form of the book, but also the literary aspects of the book. He has a lot of knowledge on books in general. Every time I talk to him, he would give me he'll send me down a rabbit hole. Like just 2 nights ago, we were talking about this 1930 sci-fi novel that has a paragraph or a passage that describes a metal book with raised hieroglyphs, which is actually describing a 3D printed book. It's very close to what I'm doing here. Yeah, so he sent me down that rabbit hole, and yeah, I really appreciate to meet someone like him, to be able to inspire me to really go deeper into the subject matter and what I'm really interested in. And for Claudia, when I first encountered her work, I was just blown away by the idea that publishing and bookmaking can actually be practiced as a artistic endeavor. Like she looks at books in a very, very different way. I would say drastically different from how a graphic designer like me would approach books, because as a graphic designer, the book is a very technical object. And for Claudia, she's really able to, because you are not formally trained in design, right? Yeah, and she has art background, and when she comes into this domain of bookmaking, she really offers so much fresh perspectives, looking at the book as a space, as a volume, as she mentioned just now as well. Yeah, those are all very very interesting and I think very important voices to have in the community. Yeah.
Thank you. So, I mean, I think something that has come up as well is, I think traditionally we might think about books as a very intimate and solitary experience between the book, the bookmaker, perhaps, and the book, and the reader and the book, and so on. But then I think what has come up here is that there are all these kind of socialities that surround a book that have allowed you to meet each other. So not just those platforms and not just you as individuals, but do you think there's something about the book itself that lends itself to this form of collaboration and cooperation and communication?
Yeah, I really, so when you really think about the book, it's not just the artifact that we think it is. It's not just pages and a spine and a cover. A book to me is closer to a container. It's a technology. A container in the sense of like Ursula Le Guin, the writer I mentioned earlier. She, in 1982, I think she wrote a story called The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction. So in this story, she talks about how like maybe one of the most important tools that we have created as humans is the bag or the container, something that brings energy home, as opposed to the weapon that destroys things, right? So to me, the book is very close to that concept. It's an artifact that brings an energy and that requires not the person that made it, but also someone that is communicating with. So it's a two-way communication device. And I think that's what makes it a powerful tool to engage in discussion. Yeah.
I also think that whenever a book is published, it doesn't belong to the artist or writer anymore, but it belongs to the person that encounters it. Now, how many times we felt that, well, it's then yours, no? And this one-to-one meeting is a very powerful thing. The fact that the book has to be activated in order to exist is something that doesn't happen with many other objects, right? So, and I also believe that the book itself changes, like it's very site-specific. So the same book today is going to be telling something different in 100 years, or in 1,000 years, in 2,000 years. So it's nothing that's stable. It's something that's always mutating, and something that's always alive. So that's like in terms of how it affects socially, but in terms of how it's been made, because I'm very much involved in the making of books as well, you always need someone else. So it's a communication also with the material, because either with the printer or the binder or the communication with the artist, the publisher. So a book is a chain that's interconnected between material, but also between how it's distributed. So that's also really interesting because, well, Darius's book, it exists one time, but most books are published in as a edition, and those books travel in crazy ways, right? So books are entities that are able to even move more than us. I remember in COVID how strong that was. I was like, I cannot travel, but my books can. And that's something that, I keep thinking a lot about the idea of them being movable and, objects that are alive in that way as well.
Yeah, so I really agree with what Claudia said as well. This idea of like making a book is a big process that involves a lot of people, because when I'm actually printing my 3D printed book, it's a very insular process, because I'm not even talking to paper merchants. I'm not talking to binders. I actually don't even know how many pages I'm making until like the very end, when I just felt like I have enough already. I'm just going to bind it, And it's really a very technical process that really requires a lot of work, especially if you want to do it at scale. And this idea that, if you think about the book as a mechanism, as a technology, the current format of it, what we call the codex, which is basically folding and stacking of paper together. This idea of like stacking multiple pieces of paper together naturally lends itself to this idea of like addition. And that's also something that I think is quite poetic in that sense that, thinking about the technology of the book in itself as intrinsically something that requires and sort of like foster collaboration even. Yeah, so like making a book, if you want to include more pages or like more information from another collaborator, just add pages, It's quite different from the ancestor of the codex, which is the papyrus scroll, which sort of like it was evolved into the codex format really because there wasn't enough space, or the space wasn't very efficiently used because the scroll only allowed for a single site to be used for recording information, because the other site is mostly involved in the rolling process and it needs to be protected. So in that sense, the current format, the codex format of the book, really in its the mechanism itself, the idea of like a stacking, a collection, a binding of various pages together. I think there's something quite beautiful in that. Yeah.
One thing also is that your 3D printed book was also made into a regular book because Gideon Temporary Press printed a risograph facsimile of your book as well, which allowed it to, I guess, reach wider audiences.
Yes, it's kind of funny and ironic. I guess like I made a book that I cannot publish, but you also ask this very important question, like what is publishing? Like, do you need scale to consider publishing something? Do you need ISBN? Do you need anything? What are the technicalities of what considers some stack of paper or not paper to be considered a book? So, because I only have one copy of the 2 books that I've done so far, it's not impossible to 3D print in scale. It's just that you need to scale up your number of 3D printers as well. So it's not really something that's very practical. So the only way to do it is sort of like, I think for Temporary Press, the conceptual part that really made it make sense was, for Gideon, he tried to frame that book as sort of like a bootleg of the book. And he always jokes that my book is trying to be a bootleg of actual books, and he's making a bootleg of my bootleg, basically. Yeah.
By the way, you can buy that book at the fair.
Yeah. So I think we can go a bit further as well into the knowledge sharing that happens. I think, Claudia, you didn't get a chance to really go into how you share knowledge through your artist book workshop. So yeah, I think if you had a chance to go into that, and also, I mean, Oscar has been opening up your own space for a library, and also you recently started teaching at Pratt, right? And Darius also teaches as well. So I think maybe you can talk a bit more about how you share that knowledge beyond, just between practitioners as well.
That has become like a very big part of my life. I started about 8 years ago by teaching in different art universities, but I was invited more to go there and give like a, 3 days class and just a few hours. And then I realized that even to myself, the book was never so valuable as a medium when I was studying. And after I graduated, I kind of saw the need to kind of share what I knew. Not that I know a lot, but a lot of people would come to me and say, Claudia, can you give me an advice? How can I do this? Or where can I do that? And I kind of saw the need. And then I thought to myself, well, why am I waiting for an invitation from someone else to ask me to teach? Why don't I just open my studio and give workshops? So I started this 3 years ago. It's called Artist Books Workshop, and it's always 4 people maximum, and 3 days, very intense, from 10 in the morning to 4 p.m. And the workshop, the goal of it is actually to have a dummy. A dummy is like a maquette, a first draft of a book, already with a form, let's say. But the difference between the workshops that I give and the workshops that kind of are already out there, which are mostly about book binding or a certain printing technique, or mine are about thinking, why does the book look like, how to guide them into a process of taking decisions so that slowly the book takes a shape, the shape that it needs to take. So, which involves a lot of thinking, a lot of discussion, a lot of, making decisions. And I also share my private collection. I have a very big collection of artist books, and they serve me as kind of material to also, share what others have done and sort of like put them on the table and discuss why would this work this way or why would this work that other way. And it's something that I still do. And if any of you want to come to Berlin, you're invited. I do them really often. Yeah.
Yeah, for me, it's, and maybe actually, that when I think about it, this a thread amongst the three of us is that we are really try to be generous with like sharing what we're learning. Maybe it's because we're very independent. We're not working under someone, under institution even. So we're 100% independent and led by a really just an inner curiosity. And we believe that this area of book making and the creation of books is very energetic and is really powerful as a tool to share knowledge. In my case, the interspecies library also started because I started to notice that a lot of artists, especially young artists, they don't have the budget to produce a lot of books. So they would make maybe like 10 copies or a few zines, or even sometimes one copy for their graduation project. But their ideas were brilliant. They're really daring, they're really risky, they ask really powerful questions. And after the graduation show or after their small exhibition in their local area, those books were lost or they were given to friends. And to me, those were documents that were so important of our time. So what I decided to do is like, there is no archive of these works, there is no library of these works. Why couldn't I just start that, Instead of asking for permission, I'll start just gathering, asking them one by one. And so that's how this project started. And I don't want these books to just live in my bookshelf with dust. I want them to be activated. So for me, it was very important to invite anyone who was so curious about them to come and like browse the books and get inspired and continue the cycle.
I just want to compliment something that some of the books that have been done in the workshop, I published them. And I've noted that was not intentional, but I've noticed that everything is then connected, like sharing kind of like goes back into publishing again, and it's like a cycle, which is very beautiful. Yeah, it's organic.
Yeah, so for me, graphic design is my passion. And I'm a graphic designer, right? And when I teach graphic design classes, and I think most of the time when students actually they have their first hands-on experiences with making a book, it's always a very inside-out process because you start with typography. You start with everything else first, layout and everything before you actually move into looking at paper, going to the print, going to the press and choosing paper. And recently, I've just started my MA, where I'm researching on 3D printing and graphic design. And one of my outcomes is actually workshops that I conduct with students. And what I do is actually I try and approach bookmaking from outside in. That means I don't think about typography yet, because if you approach making a book with a 3D printer, you are very much approaching it from its material form, from the other direction in. Typography is the last thing I think about. I didn't really move into the typeface that I've tried to design until my second book. Because my first book, nobody can read it, doesn't matter, because I'm exploring the form of the book. So in that workshop, I really try to move in the other direction. It's quite interesting experience, I think, for myself, looking at how books can actually sort of like move away from being a technical object, more so to look at it from a point of like print craft, but also like beyond print craft in its conventional sense with paper. Yeah, so yeah, that's just one of my.
Okay. Yes, it's 4:15. Let's open it up for questions from the audience. Anyone interested in finding out more? We have a mic that will be passed to you. No. Okay, I have other questions. I have backup questions. Okay. You can think about it. I will open it up again after I ask this question. So, speaking of graphic design being a passion, since I'm representing the design collection here at SAM, I think we kind of, besides Darius, you've kind of talked a little bit, just touched a bit on what design is or whether that factors at all into your practice. And actually, Claudia, you said you're kind of like you're denying that role in that sense. And then Oscar, you've had this history as you started out as an industrial designer. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a bit more about design in the context of bookmaking, how big of a factor, or the book practices that you are engaging with, Oscar. Yeah.
So design, as I understand it, is sort of a deliberate creation of a product or a system or an object. So books are the result of design in some way, right? Because they're deliberately made for a purpose or sometimes to surprise even. So in my case, I consider books or like the aspect of designing books is something very, very critical. And most of the books that I'm interested in are actually critical, sometimes even of the book, or like the pig book, right? Using, acknowledging that the glue is part of the animal also. I have books where, like, for example, the artist decided to design the cover. It's a book about sharks, and the cover is using sandpaper because the skin of the shark is supposed to be exactly like the feeling of sandpaper. So these are decisions that are really interesting, They're using the book to embody another species. I'm also interested lately in the idea of some artists actually trying to use materials that are not derived by animals, perhaps just by vegetal, like so completely no type of glues, no type of, but only vegetable origin, natural inks. So these are really deliberate decisions as well to step away from that idea of the book as like, if you go to old antiquarian bookstores or old books, all of the books were produced with leather and there's different animals. You're looking at the skin of animals covering all of these books. So it's very important to be critical about like even what materials you use to design an object as a book.
It's not that I try to deny design, but I'm just saying that I'm not trained as a designer. But of course, I use design as a tool, right? Because at the end of the line, books are objects in space. So they need to have a form, and form is design. So I say that my books are concept-based because every single decision I use in giving a form to the book is deliberately taken. So, of course, design is important. Yeah.
Yeah. So, again, because I was trained as a graphic designer and as a student, the book has always been a highly technical object. I was always taught that the book is the culmination of all of your skill set as a graphic designer because you're handling images, handling text, handling layout. But I was always told that if you are a good designer, you would smell the paper, you would care about the grain of the paper, you really go deep into the paper and the making of the book, how well it opens, does it open flat, and things like that. So I guess it's very interesting to think about art books and also when people who are not formally trained in graphic design, when they come into making books like Claudia, the kind of perspectives that I think is really very much needed. In fact, one of my most important inspiration for me is actually this book called House of Leaves. It's actually a book that has sort of like a cult status. in the international stage. This book is actually designed by the author himself. Legend has it that he flew down to the publishing HQ to typeset his words himself, because his words needs to be said in a very specific manner, designed in a very specific format, which to me is very interesting, because this author cares perhaps more about the typography or the layout of the book more than most graphic designers, and including myself, because like, wow, he flew many hours just to typeset, and he's not formally trained, and I find that fascinating. Yeah, this idea of like what role does design have in the making of a book, but also the contents of the book. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. Question. Yay. Yeah. The mic's coming to you. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I actually lived in New York, and I just moved back 3 months ago, so I wish I visited your library, Oscar. Sounds amazing. My question is, I find that books are very much kind of like, as you mentioned, Oscar, like a solitary, I think Claudia mentioned like this solitary personal relationship with the book. So I was wondering if you've kind of navigated or thought about how do you kind of change the dynamic, especially with Claudia, your work in exhibition space, which I find to be much more of a open, not so solitary space, or for Oscar, like your library, or I think all three of you were talking about collaboration and community. I think there's a bit of that tension between like the book as a kind of a volume space between you and the book, and then this outer space. So I don't know, just an open-ended question. If you had thoughts about that kind of tension, and yeah.
What you say is very important, because we shouldn't forget that books are social objects as well. No, they bring people together. They create community. They create discussions. They gather information. They give information. So they're social beings as well. In that way, I would say.
For me, definitely it's interesting that, because there's exhibitions about books where you can browse the books, but there's also ones where the books are behind a glass or a vitrine, right? But I think it's important to consider that one way I think about books is also as evidence, as documents. So an interesting way to also think of books in an exhibition is, what do they say collectively? If an artist puts like 10 books, there is relationships between them. So now they go beyond being one individual document that you engage with. Now it's in relationship to other documents, and they together say something. That's kind of how I started with my project, the Interspecies Library, where it's not just about each book, but together they're starting to show a pattern, and the pattern is that people from around the world are trying to question their own fields and how the human is always the center, and they're trying to say, let's decenter the human and try to focus on other organisms. So these books collectively are saying, this is happening now. So yeah, that's another way to also think about it.
So for me, in terms of my 3D printing or 3D printer book practice, I guess it's also this idea that I am aware that when you look at my 3D book, you are not always engaging with the content, because there's something else that hits you first, which is its materiality. You're just preoccupied with this idea, oh, this is a 3D printer book. You don't really engage very the way conventional books are supposed to engage you with. And I think there's something quite interesting about that. Then my book don't really function as a book, but more so the form of it. I had hoped that it could, spur on some interesting conversations about what the book is. Not so much as to try and say that 3D printed book is a future, but more so it's an alternative future, and all the conversations that can be generated from just engaging with the material book itself. Yeah.
And just one last thing, in the two examples I showed about my work in the questions library, but also in palimpsest, the one with the photocopies, they all need the user to be active so that the work exists. Without the user being active, there is no work.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing many things that is interesting about books. I was thinking, so you are so interested about books, and what sort of books do you collect in your own collection?
My collection is concept-based, and I was really looking at them, and I make different categories, and I think I'm interested in asemic writing, concrete poetry, language-based, and I don't know, but it's so funny. I was looking at it, and about 70% of my collection is soft cover, it's no hardcover, and a lot of them have a white cover. So I like white books, apparently. Yeah. Oh, and I also open every single book I've made. I have them in cabinets, so when people visit my studio, they can also browse them. Yeah.
Yeah, so for me, one confession is that I don't really like to read. Books to me has always been objects because of the way I really work closely with them was through my practice as a designer. And when I do collect books, it's always about, like what I mentioned just now, the House of Leaves, books that has a very specific history of how it's made, how it's produced, and also books that have very specific content within maybe just one page of it. And I see getting the book and collecting it part of me absorbing certain information from the book. But that being said, I don't always read all my books end to end. In fact, I don't think I've ever done that. Yeah, so yeah, that's just.
For me, I besides what I show, like these books on interspecies and then geology, I like books that I don't understand, that are subjects that I have no idea about. Those are really attractive to me, even if they're enigmatic, or maybe the language is made up, or there's something mysterious about them. I'm attracted to what I really don't understand. For me, that's really exciting. It brings me back to when I was, 5, 6 years old, and I open a book and I don't know what the hell I'm seeing. I like that, yeah.
Any other questions? We can take one more.
Hi. I'm actually just going to ask Darius this question. Because you mentioned so many times that you are a graphic designer, a very technical one, right? But then in your own more creative work, you do take a lot of chances. I think in a previous conversation, you talked about how much cosmic alignment there is in certain specific parts of your work. Maybe you can give the audience those examples now.
So there's actually a reason why because the book in my daily work takes on a very different meaning, and when I engage with book and book design, it has always been sort of like very transactional, and because of that, I really do yearn another sort of like a relationship with bookmaking, and that was why I really wanted to explore the book not in the context of why how it's commercially made, or go beyond how it's being perceived currently by practitioners. And so I sort of like to phrase my practice in this way, like I design for artists. I have a lot of, most of my clientele and collaborators, they are artists, and I make art for designers. In that sense, this book, actually, there are a lot of specific details within that only are interesting to the graphic designer, I feel. So there are, in that sense, I guess I do see it as two modes of working. When I'm designing and also when I'm making this book, I'm not taking the role of, let's say, the traditional graphic designer taking on that hat. So I'm actually approaching it as an art object. I mean, there's only one, so it's very hard to call it beyond an art object. Yeah.
Okay. And any last call? Oh, okay. Give chance. Okay.
Thanks for giving chance. Thank you for all of your sharing. I think the three of you have shared about the formation, the creation, dissemination, and propagation of books or book forms. But I wonder if you can share more about the opposite of that in terms of like dissociation, erasure, forgetting, or ideas about lost. I think you were previously sharing about lost in translation, perhaps, or something that is lost in storage or just kept there and not being activated. Could you share? Could all of you share about your idea about this opposite side of creation?
One thing that I found interesting with the Interspecies Library project is that there are a number of artists that are trying to, instead of the book answering questions, the book becomes something that confounds you. So it makes you more confused on purpose. And they do this so like you realize that human language is limited. You know, our human language is really limited. We only see the world from the perspective of humans because our language is human-based. So a lot of these artists are using books to like, sometimes there is no words in the entire book, or sometimes there is a language that seems made up, like the language of an insect, or the language of another species. So that is the way I interpret your question in my case. It's more like, in my opinion, books can be powerful also if they create doubt and if they create more questions.
Well, I really agree with what Oscar said about this idea that when you read a book, you sometimes are really confronted by the limitations of written languages. Because when I was 3D printing my book as well, a lot of people who have seen it, they don't know what text is printed within. It's English, but because I haven't sorted out how to make it more legible, and it's been always like a sort of like very fuzzy letters, yeah. And I sometimes find it quite interesting that the book itself is consumed not with its literary contents. Sometimes it's also about the material and yeah. So yeah, you.
Perhaps I don't have an answer in terms of my own practice, but I do think about, for example, the book can also be a political object. So we are lucky enough to be able to self-publish whatever we want to self-publish, right? But in other countries, that's not being possible. Like independent publishers are being forced to add an ISBN number to their publications, and if not, they cannot publish it. So in that way, being independent, it's a luxury that not everyone can have access to. So we also have to be conscious about that we are being privileged to be able to put out content, whatever we want to say, out in the world.
Thank you so much for sharing. I think we will have to end here, but you can also visit them at their booths. So yeah, I think just to sum up, I think what's really beautiful about this conversation is that we started with the book, but the book became this synonym for space, for 3D objects, for something that exists in time, for something that can disappear, that's not meant to be read, and that's even a chain in a distribution. So yeah, I think one thing also that we want to end on, we talked about before we had this conversation, was that one of you defined the book also as a portal. So I think that's a note that we want to end on. Yeah, thank you so much everybody for coming.